The war was over. In Virginia, Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. Soon after, Johnston followed. And yet, here, along the Rio Grande, the war did not end. On this remote stretch of Texas coast, far from the great armies of the East, the conflict lingered. The Trans-Mississippi had not surrendered, and the men here were still under arms. In May of 1865, they would still march to battle. Here, on this ground, the final shots of the Civil War would be fired. And in one last bitter irony, the Confederacy would win. This is the story of Texans at the Battle of Palmito Ranch. The lower Rio Grande Valley was unlike any other theater of the Civil War. While the great armies clashed in the east, this region remained isolated, yet far from inactive. Across the Rio Grande lay Mexico, a nation in the midst of its own conflict. French forces under Emperor Maximilian vied for control against the Republican government of Benito Juarez. But unlike the Confederacy, Mexico was untouched by the Union naval blockade. For Confederate leaders, this presented a critical opportunity. For Union leaders, it posed a serious concern. Not only was there fear, however unlikely, of a Confederate alignment with French-backed forces in Mexico, but more importantly, the Rio Grande provided access to international markets the Confederacy desperately needed. Through the small port of Baghdad, just across the river, Confederate cotton flowed outward in enormous quantities. In return came weapons, supplies, and hard currency, sustaining the Confederate war effort long after other avenues had been cut off. Union forces clearly understood its importance. In 1863, they moved to occupy Brownsville and the lower Rio Grande Valley, hoping to shut down this vital trade. But in 1864, those same forces were withdrawn to support the Red River Campaign in Louisiana. When that campaign ended in failure, Union troops returned to the coast, but the region remained contested. By the spring of 1865, the war in Texas had taken on a very different character. It was no longer a campaign of large armies, but a war of outposts, patrols, and uncertain authority. Even after the surrender of Lee and Johnston, there was no immediate cessation of hostilities here. And so, along the Rio Grande, the war went on. By May of 1865, two small forces faced each other along the Texas coast near Brazos, Santiago. Union forces were commanded by Colonel Theodore H. Barrett. His command included the 62nd and 87th United States Colored Troops, the 34th Indiana Infantry, and two companies of the 2nd Texas U.S. Cavalry, fighting dismounted, along with artillery support. Though well armed, many of these troops had limited combat experience. Opposing them was a smaller but more seasoned Confederate force under Colonel John Salmon "Rip" Ford. Ford's command included Giddings's Texas Cavalry, Anderson's battalion, and other Texas cavalry detachments, supported by artillery under Captain O.G. Wilcox. These were experienced frontier soldiers, accustomed to mobility, independent action, and the harsh conditions of South Texas.
So, on May 11th, in the morning of 1865, Colonel Theodore H. Barrett, the commander of the garrison at Brazos, Santiago, decided to send 8 companies of the 62nd U.S. Colored Infantry under his second command, Lieutenant Colonel David Branson, to the mainland of Texas. The original plan was for them to go by steamboat from Brazos Santiago on the north end of Brazos Island to Point Isabel on the mainland.
No one knows for certain why Colonel Theodore Barrett ordered Union troops from Brazos Island onto the Texas mainland in May of 1865. At the time, Barrett offered no clear explanation. And in the months afterward, several different theories emerged. One account claimed the expedition was intended to gather horses for the 2nd Texas Cavalry U.S. Another explanation, given later during a court of inquiry, described the movement as a simple foraging expedition. But the actual troop movements suggest something larger was intended. Many historians have concluded that Barrett may have been seeking a battlefield success, a final opportunity for personal distinction before the war came to an end. Whatever his motives, the expedition nearly failed before it even began. The troops assembled before dawn on May 11th, preparing to move from Brazos Island to the mainland. But then a norther blew in. Bad weather swept across the coast. The steamer transporting the troops broke down, delaying the movement and disrupting the operation before the first shots were fired. Colonel David Branson soon returned to headquarters with troubling news. The original plan, he reported, was not going to work. In response, Colonel Barrett changed the operation. Rather than attempt the original crossing, Union forces would move to the southern end of Brazos Island and cross onto the mainland near Boca Chica Pass. The force would consist of the same infantry units, reinforced by 2 dismounted companies of the 2nd Texas Cavalry U.S., roughly 50 additional men. Because of the shallow water and difficult terrain, the crossing itself became a slow and exhausting operation. The troops were ferried across in small skiffs, while the few wagons and ambulances accompanying the expedition were forced across a large sandbar near Boca Chica Pass. Moving men, equipment, and supplies in darkness across the coastal flats took far longer than expected.
It's 9:30 in the evening before the force, which was supposed to have made it to Point Isabel 12 hours before, actually gets onto the Texas mainland. And then Branson marches the troops toward White's Ranch, which is the end of the railroad that the Federals had built in 1863 during Banks' Rio Grande expedition. There's supposed to be a Confederate outpost there, and Branson makes a long march to outflank it and move against it from the west with the intention of capturing whatever Confederates are there, supplies, cattle, horses, which indicates that there is that there is some sort of hostile intent of the Federal movement.
The battle was not fought by soldiers unaware that the war was ending. Both sides knew that Lee and Johnston had surrendered. News of Lincoln's assassination had also reached the Rio Grande by early May. But in Texas, the situation remained uncertain. Many Confederates believed the Trans-Mississippi Department would continue the fight, and those who remained in the ranks were determined to resist any Federal advance. Union troops expected resistance too. Anger over Lincoln's assassination hardened attitudes in the Federal camps, while commanders worried that Confederate forces in Texas might attempt to align themselves with the French-backed government in Mexico. This was not a peaceful occupation or a simple foraging expedition. Both armies moved cautiously, maneuvered tactically, and prepared for combat. And at Palmito Ranch, combat is exactly what they found.
When the Federals move into White's Ranch, of course, they find that it's been abandoned. There's nothing there. And so Branson decides that he's going to rest his troops. But not long after dawn, a Confederate cavalry patrol spots them. They're also spotted by Mexicans on the south bank of the Rio Grande. And Branson figures, well, now I've been spotted. There's no reason to stay here. And he begins the push westward that will ultimately take him to Palmetto Ranch around midday on the 12th of May. Deciding to continue on westward, again, for no explained purpose, what he's trying to do, Branson pushes his command, which remember is 250 men from the 62nd USCT, 50 men from the 2nd Texas US Cavalry dismounted westward toward Palmetto Ranch. So this small Confederate patrol was pulling back in front of him. When he gets to Palmetto Ranch, he finally finds the Confederate base that he's been looking for. They're officially issued rations for 10 days. There are 3 sick Confederates too ill to move, a couple horses, 4 beef cattle. Branson captures all of this, but now Captain Robinson, who is in command of Giddings Battalion in this part of the Rio Grande, has assembled essentially half of his battalion, 60 men, and he's present. And there is a skirmish, and the two sides exchange fire for quite a while, and then they sort of break contact, and Branson has to make a decision. What is he going to do? And without any specific orders as to what he's going to attempt to accomplish, he decides to pull back to White's Ranch. And he sends a message back to Brazos Island to Colonel Barrett that this is what he's doing. And Captain Robinson reoccupies Palmetto Ranch, and he has sent a message back to the commander at Fort Brown, Colonel John S. Rip Ford, to tell him that, hey, there are Federals on the mainland. When Rip Ford gets Robinson's message, his take on it is very different. And both he and Brigadier General James Slaughter, who's in overall command, Slaughter sees this as the beginning of a Federal advance. He doesn't see a reason to resist it. He's ready to evacuate Brownsville and pull back to the west. And Rip Ford will have none of this. As far as Ford is concerned, and Slaughter too, after the March meeting with Lew Wallace, there was a truce on the Rio Grande. Wallace and Ford and Slaughter, when they met on March 11th, had all agreed that the war wasn't going to be decided on the Rio Grande. It was pointless for men to die here. There was an unofficial truce. But when Major General Walker refused to even forward Wallace's proposals that would have Texas ditch the Confederacy and make a league with the United States against Maximilian, then Wallace had said, well, then there's no truce. And the Federals were operating on that basis. They never communicated that to the Confederates, and so the Confederates assumed that the truce was still on. And this means that Barrett sending Branson to the mainland is a violation of that truce. And that infuriates Rip Ford. That's an insult to the honor of the Confederacy, an insult to him, an insult to the honor of Texas. And also, of course, Rip Ford is a very combative guy. And he had chased the Yankees out of this part of Texas in the summer of 1864. And he's not going to let them come back in. So he tells Ford, well, you can retreat and go to hell if you want. These are my men, and I'm going to fight.
Ford immediately ordered his cavalry and artillery to assemble at Fort Brown. But his command was scattered across more than 20 miles of the lower Rio Grande Valley, where the troopers had been foraging to keep their horses fed. Gathering the Confederate force would take the rest of May 12th, and most of the night. Ford sent word to Captain William N. Robinson at Palmito Ranch to hold his position. Reinforcements were coming. Not until the morning of May 13th would Ford finally lead his assembled cavalry north toward Palmito Ranch, and the final battle of the Civil War.
So Ford has set in motion, bringing the Confederates' main body to Palmetto Ranch, and ironically, Barrett has set in motion the same thing going on the Federal side. So when he gets Branson's message, I've encountered the Confederates, there's been skirmishing at Palmetto Ranch, I've captured a few prisoners, I've had one man wounded pulling back from Palmetto Ranch to White Ranch, a soldier in the 62nd USCT. Instead of getting the order to pull back to Brazos Island, Barrett decides to bring reinforcements. So Rip Ford is bringing reinforcements. Barrett, contrary to what Branson expects, is not going to send orders for the 62nd USCT to pull back to Brazos Island. Instead, he's going to assemble 9 companies of the 34th Indiana Veteran Volunteer Infantry under their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Morrison, and personally lead them to reinforce White's Ranch. So on the night of May 12th, you have Ford assembling his forces, preparing to march in the morning to Palmetto Ranch. You have Barrett bringing reinforcements onto the mainland via Boca Chica Pass again, and marching toward White's Ranch. And he's going to get to White Ranch on the morning of the 13th. And so the Federals are going to reinforce first. When the troops from the 34th Indiana veteran volunteers arrive on the field, the Yankees now have 500 infantry, a handful of wagons, a couple of ambulances, and they are going to renew the push west. And they're going to run into Captain Robinson's 60-man detachment of cavalry. And there's going to be a replay on the morning of the 13th of what had happened on the afternoon of the 12th. The Federals are going to steadily push the Confederates back toward Palmetto Ranch, and then they're going to occupy Palmetto Ranch, and Robinson is going to have to fade away from it and make a stand on the plain to the west of the ranch, which is, remember, at this point in the big loop in the Rio Grande. So the ranch is actually sort of midway up that loop, but then you have Palmetto Hills. So the river loops down, Palmetto Hills down here in the bottom, and Robinson is up here in the plain to the west of it. And this is where the battle is going to have a little bit of a lull on the 13th. And so when they get to Palmetto Ranch, the Federals decide to stop, to take a break. Barrett sends a couple of companies from the 34th down into the bend of the river to sweep Palmetto Hill to make sure there are no Confederates there. And then the Yankees are looking at Captain Robinson's 60 men out there in the plain, and Barrett's trying to figure out what to do. What is he going to do now? And he's sort of at a loss for how to proceed. And he rides out with Lieutenant Colonel Morrison and Lieutenant Colonel Branson, the commanders of his two regiment, to the skirmish line up on Palmetto Hill. And he finds Second Lieutenant Charles Jones there in command of the 34th Company K. And he congratulates him, for the job of, clearing the hill. And then he asks this second lieutenant, in the presence of two lieutenant colonels, well, Lieutenant, what do you think we should do now? And Lieutenant Jones, who's been in the Army for a while, knows that lieutenants don't usually give advice to colonels. And he's like, well, whatever you say, sir. And Barrett insists, no, I'd really like to know what you think we should do. And so Jones sort of says, all right, well, if you're actually going to ask, I will actually give you an answer. And he proposes to take his company in Company A of the 34th, the two that are there on the hill, and sneak them along the riverbank under the cover of the chaparral and get behind Robinson's 60 men out there on the plain. In the meantime, he wants the 62nd to maneuver out in front of Palmetto Hill to keep the attention of the Confederates. He's going to go around, and once everybody's in place, they will attack out of the chaparral into the rear of the Confederates while the rest of the Federal force attacks them from the front. And if everything works right, they're going to surround them and they're going to grab them. And without consulting either Morrison or Branson, Barrett says, that's a great plan, Lieutenant. Carry it out. So the young lieutenant here, Jones, begins to take the two companies of the 44th along the riverbank, sneaking around, and then suddenly, to his amazement, come marching across the plain toward him is the entire 62nd USCT, which is not part of the plan, right? They're supposed to be demonstrating, keeping Robinson, hey, look here, while Jones is going around behind him. And so Jones steps out of the chaparral, and Lieutenant Colonel Morrison rides up to him, and the lieutenant colonel says, I've been ordered to report to you for orders, which is completely non sequitur as far as the young lieutenant is concerned. And so this wasn't the plan. He's sort of confused. He got to figure out what to do. So he tells Morrison, okay, well, get your guys into the chaparral and follow us. And so now this, instead of a small two-company thing where you got maybe 60 guys, you've got 260 guys who are trying to snake through the chaparral here. And it takes a lot longer. But eventually the Federals are sort of in place. And Robinson is totally unaware. He's still looking at Palmetto Ranch where the 34th Indiana is. Jones has his men spread out. Morrison's getting his men spread out. It looks like the trap is going to work exactly like it's supposed to. And at that instant, one of the colored soldiers accidentally discharges his rifle. And the Confederates look over there and they see this mass of Yankees that have gotten on their flank and rear. And being cavalry, they do what cavalry is very good at. They use their mobility to get out of there. The Federals charge out of the chaparral, fire a volley, run after the Confederates, who are, of course, outdistance them easily. They wheel to the west. They get up onto a small hill. They fire another volley, but then the Confederates are gone. They're out of range. And so Lieutenant Jones calls a halt. Here comes Colonel Barrett again with Lieutenant Colonel Morrison in tow, and they ride up to this little hillock where the Federals had stopped. And once more, Barrett congratulates the lieutenant for what he's accomplished. That the plan didn't work wasn't the lieutenant's fault. It was a good effort. And then he once again asked Lieutenant, "What do you think we should do now?" So for a second time, in the presence of two lieutenant colonels, Branson and Morrison, Barrett is asking the second lieutenant, "What do you think we should do?" And Lieutenant Jones is no longer willing to play the game. He says, "Well, whatever you want, sir." Barrett insists, and he goes, "Well, sir, infantry is not going to catch cavalry. So unless there's some particular point that you want me to occupy, I think we've done what we can do." And Barrett basically, once again, yields to the lieutenant's opinion. He says, "Well, yes, I guess we've done what we can do." And he orders everybody to pull back to Palmetto Hill, where they'll have lunch. We'll have lunch. And he'll try and figure out what to do. Everybody's sitting around. They're very tired. They're eating their lunch. They put out no pickets. There's no skirmish line, nothing. And in that environment, here comes Rip Ford with 270 reinforcements, the rest of Robinson's battalion, all of Anderson's battalion, and a 6-gun battery of artillery, the 3rd Texas Field Artillery. It's well after noon when he reaches the battlefield. It's sort of mid-afternoon. Ford deploys his troops behind a convenient stand of chaparral. The Federals up on Palmetto Hill can't see them. And Ford, who's not wearing his Confederate uniform today, he's in civilian clothes, right? So goes out in front of the chaparral, takes his spyglass out. He looks very carefully at the Federals. He estimates their numbers precisely. It's about 500. And he says to himself, "Well, there's 500 Federal infantry there. I've got, if I add Robinson's men to me, I've got just over 300 cavalry and a battery of artillery, but everybody knows that infantry is superior to cavalry on the battlefield, and this could be the last fight of the war," he thinks to himself, "and I will probably get whipped." So he's not sure whether he should fight or not, but he decides to test the temper of his men. So he rides through the ranks of his men, and he finds out that these fellows are eager for a fight. They want to fight, and they start yelling, "Rip, rip, rip." And Ford says, "Okay, well, if they're willing to fight, I'm willing to lead them. I'm willing to lead them." So he makes his disposition. He splits his artillery into 3 sections. He's going to send 2 companies of cavalry with 1 section of artillery off in a flanking maneuver to the north. And so their job is to, hopefully without being spotted, get onto the military road that leads back to Brazos Island, to get to the top in this great big bend in the river and cut the Federal retreat. The other section of artillery will be in reserve. The 3rd section will come out and prepare to shell Palmetto Hill and the Yankees that are there, and the rest of the cavalry will stand ready to do whatever is necessary. And so the Confederates begin to make these movements. Unfortunately, doing things surreptitiously doesn't work. There's a dust cloud from the moving companies of cavalry, the artillery. The Federals spot that, and suddenly Barrett realizes he's in trouble. And he's sort of stunned for a moment about what to do. And then finally, he sends 2 companies of the 34th Indiana, B&E, out onto the prairie to act as a skirmish line while he tries to decide, what should I do? It takes him a while. Morrison and Branson convince him, we don't need to be at the bottom of this loop in the river. This is a really bad place for us to be. We need to get back to the road. And so, rather belatedly, Barrett decides to do this. The 62nd USCT is closest to him. He orders them to move out first. As they start to move out, the white troops, the 34th Indiana and the 2 companies of Texas Unionists up on Palmetto Hill, see the black soldiers leaving. and they make a sort of biased decision or get a biased impression that colored troops are running away. They're leaving us in the lurch. So they're very anxious and they're kind of unhappy about this. But very quickly, Barrett comes up and he tells them, okay, to join the retreat. So the federal regiments begin to retreat along the riverbank. There are diverging trails. The 62nd is on one that crosses path with the one that the 34th on. These two regiments are actually going to collide. And instead of stopping and letting the 62nd, which got to the intersection first, pass through, the 34th is going to break their column and go through them. So there's a lot of disorder and confusion. Rip Ford sees this, and he knows he's got a great opportunity. The only thing that's given him any pause is that just as the fighting gets going and he started to throw a couple of shells toward Palmetto Hill, a steamboat is coming upriver from the direction of the Gulf of Mexico, and there's no breeze, so its flag is limp, and Ford suspects that that's carrying Yankee reinforcements. So he has an artillery fire at the steamboat. Fortunately, they miss because the breeze kicks up, and they realize that from the Mexican imperial flag flying from the steamboat, that it's one of the King and Kennedy steamers operating out of Brownsville under the Mexican flag, because the Rio Grande is a neutral river. So don't have to worry about the steamboat. Focus on the Yankees. And Ford realizes that Barrett has left those two companies of the 34th Indiana completely unsupported. Those skirmishers out there, it's only about 34 of them. No support whatsoever. And there's an opportunity he can't resist. He orders his cavalry to charge. They come thundering down on this thin line of Union skirmishers. And at this moment is when the last casualty of the war is inflicted, or the last man to actually die in combat outright is killed here. He takes a mini bullet into the head and falls. The rest of the Federals are surrounded and captured. This, of course, takes a little bit of time. The Federals are getting closer to the top of the river. Barrett understands, okay, this is not good. I've lost my skirmishers. I need a rear guard. So he rides up to the tail end of the column of the 34th Indiana, and that happens to be Company K under good old Second Lieutenant Jones. And he rides up to him and he tells Jones, I need a rear guard. You've done great today. I need you to be my rear guard. And Jones is like, no, I'm not going to do it. My men are down to 2 rounds each, and I can't do it. And once again, Barrett sort of yields to this lieutenant. He says, I understand, Lieutenant. I'm asking too much of you. And so he lets the 34th go, and he rides over to the 2nd Texas, which has also been fighting all day. Its men only have 1 or 2 rounds each, but he tells the commander of those two companies to be a rear guard. And that commander says, hey, I don't have ammunition. And Barrett said, it doesn't matter. I need a rear guard. So those 50 Texas Unionists fan out. The rest of the Federals are going to get to the top of the river. They're going to beat the Confederates there. But this leaves those 2 Texas companies on their own. They fire 2 volleys, and then they disappear and try and hide into the chaparral. And Rip Ford's guys are going to swoop down, and they're going to capture almost every one of them. The Federals do get to the top of the bend in the river. The Confederates don't trap them, barely, just don't trap them. And then after that, it's sort of fighting withdrawal back toward Brazos Island. And interestingly, despite some of the stories that were told after the battle, it's the 62nd Colored that provides the rear guard, and they perform very credibly. The terrain, of course, is on their favor. You've got tidal sloughs just to the north of the road. You got the Rio Grande to the south of the road, so it's a very narrow front. The Confederates can't flank anymore, so having the advantage of cavalry mobility doesn't help them. The 34th during the retreat doesn't behave especially well. The men are exhausted. These are veteran troops. They know when they've been mismanaged. They don't have much faith in Barrett. They have no love for him whatsoever. They're going through very difficult terrain, and they start to throw away equipment. Knapsacks and haversacks and stuff go away. One of the 2 color bearers had cut his foot months earlier, and it had healed badly, so he can't keep up. So he hands his flag to the other color bearer, who's now carrying both the state regimental color and the U.S. flag, which is a big burden, right? These flags, remember, are huge. And so he falls off to the side of the road, and nobody notices that he disappears. And so he goes off into the chaparral, and he's left behind. And something like 70 stragglers from the 34th Indiana fall behind during the retreat. They're worn out. They can't keep up. The color bearer tears both flags off a flagstaff. He tries to hide the regimental flag. He wraps the U.S. flag around him and attempts to swim the Rio Grande River, but Mexicans or Frenchmen, somebody on the other side shoots at him, and he has to turn around and come back, and he's going to be captured along with his flag. The Confederates are going to find the other flag the next day. They're going to get both the 34th Indiana and his flags. Barrett is, of course, extremely unhappy with Morrison. He thinks he's not conducting the retreat well. He's got to prefer charges against him and get him court-martialed after the battle. But as the Federals fall back, they send for reinforcements from Brazos Island. The 87th USCT is going to come out to reinforce. Of course, it's not going to arrive till the next that evening. Just toward dusk, General Slaughter shows up with Carter's battalion of cavalry under Captain Carrington. They're going to reinforce Ford and sort of take over for him. And you get a final stalemate. The Federals go across an embankment, manage to get over it, and now there's water between the Confederates and the Federals. And the two sides blaze away at each other without inflicting any casualties until dark. And at that point, Slaughter wants to stay on the field, and Ford says no. The Federals are going to bring reinforcements out from Brazos Island. We're not going to stay here to be counterattacked. And so he convinces Slaughter to pull back to Palmetto Ranch. Barrett stays in place all night, gets the reinforcements. The next morning expects the battle to continue, but the Confederates are gone. The 34th Indiana has already booked it back to the island because Morrison believed that's what he had been ordered to do. So that morning, the 62nd and 87th sort of go back with their bands playing and flags flying and that kind of stuff. And that brings the actual combat at Palmetto Ranch to an end.
The field was held. The enemy was driven back. But it was a victory without consequence. The war had already been decided. Within days, Rip Ford disbanded his command. His soldiers went home. And the war, at last, came to an end. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future episodes of Lone Star Warriors, Texans in the Civil War. Thank you for watching.